Okay, folks, it is showtime here in Atlanta. So, Atlanta, are you ready to go? Are you ready to rock and roll? Yes. All right. Thank you for all of your hard work, and I am delighted to introduce group number 1, Nested Coastal Observatory Network.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name is Rita Tutanico, and I'm representing this interdisciplinary group of colleagues that all contribute to this. Our topic is Nested Coastal Observatory Systems, Developing Resilient Coastal Communities. So the basic idea is we want to create a network of coastal observatories, and the observatory level will be local communities who will apply to be part of this network. And the big thing that we think is very important is they would co-develop their coastal questions that they need solutions for with local stakeholders. The big idea also is to have a convergence of data. We know there's a lot of existing ecological data, but towns will need other data such as economic, their local governance, cultural heritage, et cetera, that they'll need in these decisions. So the idea is have these different diverse communities apply, and then we'll have regional hubs that will actually bring together best practices. There'll be actually physical locations for education and demonstration sites, and then we'll have a coordination through a national team, which will be a virtual team. So this will be done with representatives from all the hubs. So the way this would work in our specific recommendations are to have making sure this is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. We want to also have the communities look at all the data that their town has available, but then identify what the data gaps are. This will be an iterative process with stakeholders. We're also going to have tiered kind of funding approach, which we recommend. They would start as a pilot of an exploratory nature, where they will actually inventory existing data. Then they'll establish the observatory with these co-developed questions. They'll then collect the data in the research process. And then the most important part is actually implementing these local solutions with their local stakeholders. So what we think is novel and the value is this idea of convergence across disciplines, the data synthesis of what we already have and what the towns will need, co-development of knowledge with stakeholders and practitioners, and a diversity of community types. We tried to represent that with the different colors and the sizes of communities, and then there'll be different levels of socioeconomic status, locations, et cetera. We want to apply this at multiple scales, as well as using global knowledge that we have for localized solutions. So the reasoning and supporting evidence, there's a number of different factors that are supported here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but the whole idea of nested research really enhances convergence, multiple scales, and interdisciplinarity. There's a lot of supporting evidence, especially from Dr. Ostrom's group, and we really want to use all this collective knowledge to actually create this nested coastal community observatory system that will be useful globally as well as locally and make localized important solutions to coastal issues. Thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone, I'm Ted, and this is my group, Maria, Suzanne, and Bowling, and our objective is to broaden participation by including K-12 education in reaching and supporting vulnerable coastal communities. In a nutshell, we believe that K-12 education is a sustainable mechanism to outreach and engagement with vulnerable communities on the issues of coastal science, community resilience, and risk reduction. When we discuss vulnerable communities, we include underserved and disadvantaged people in coastal regions and those at risk for coastal hazards. We tend to think that once we connect kids with their parents, they are safe during disasters or hazards, but kids experience hazards differently, and we don't take the time to interrogate those experiences. We're thinking specifically that of K-12 as a cross-cutting issue across all projects, NSF projects, would require that educators have an integral role in scoping and development of CoPe projects from the outset, and that social, natural, and physical outreach scientists on CoPe projects should work directly with educators in the co-development of PK to 12 classroom activities and projects based on research outcomes. So not only do we expect that you would develop those projects, but that you would include PK to 12 right across the board. That it is also our expectation that CoPe education partners would receive adequate specific resources adequate resources specific to the educational component of a CoPe project. For example, if there's financial resources, that they would be given compensated equally. And finally on this, it is our expectation that any NSF program evaluation will require an assessment of the educational outcome, so that we know whether those relationships are built and how successful that component of the project has been. With respect to the impact and the value, PK to 12 educational systems are embedded in communities, and they provide broad reach and access to established relationships with vulnerable communities. It's almost like a resource that is underutilized. PK to 12 educational system provide a mechanism.
That's because it's time. So just wrap up.
Yeah.
Last thought.
Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Annie. This is Rob, and we collaborated with our colleague Jorge to develop this proposal. Our recommendation is a network of coastal observatory sites focused around understanding and predicting change in human and natural systems. This is a research-driven proposal where groups of PIs will propose sites that are representative of broader systems. These observatories will incorporate both a more and a less developed environment. And we're really focusing on a coupled human-natural systems approach here, where we can connect data that's collected on the ground from multiple platforms with process-based and predictive models in an iterative process. We're going to be able to leverage structures within NSF and integrate this existing data into these models. The integration of qualitative as well as quantitative data is highly encouraged. However, the development of these methodological frameworks will be left to the PIs who are proposing these observatory systems. We recommend the incorporation of a more dynamic PI structure to broaden participation, as well as the inclusion of multiple PIs from a representation of different disciplines. We also recommend that each site will require a data manager for the archival of data in a central repository, which is public access.
So the impact and the value of this type of an observatory network is that it focuses resources on individual sites that might be representative of a broader set of sites. This allows for high resolution, long-term data collection and model evaluation. It can integrate members from multiple communities and different disciplines, and allows understanding of how these physical and natural systems, as well as human natural systems, can be comparable or different. And it enables a complete and iterative evaluation of these predictive coupled dynamical system models. Using high resolution past data that is collected as part of these networks, this can be both qualitative and quantitative data. And so the reasoning and supporting evidence is very similar to the first proposal you heard about today, and it can build on the successes and shortcomings of other site-based structures that the NSF has set up in the past. These could include the critical zone observatories, long-term ecological research, and experimental watersheds, among others, which have had decades of support and lessons learned. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Erica Fuchs. This is Iris Tien and Eric Jones, and we are here to talk about a redesign of coastal cities, city concepts for the future. So a summary of the problem is that islands and coastal areas are currently under threat due to rising seas and extreme weather events. In particular, in these communities, they're very vulnerable. They're low income, often immigrants who work in the tourism, service, and fishing industries. So we want to keep those communities intact whenever possible. And new forms of cities are needed.
So what we propose is to develop, implement, and evaluate new designs of these coastal communities so that they are able to stay in place when possible. The first idea is to do floating cities. So these are cities subject to sea level rise and flooding. And then the second option that we would like to investigate is this idea of raised cities for cities that are subject to hurricanes, such that they may have to evacuate in a hazard, but they would be able to easily return to their communities to keep these communities intact. And finally, we would also like to investigate different methods and approaches to providing critical utility services for these different types of communities, including self-sufficient and more centralized generation and distribution mechanisms. And we propose to investigate this by using a multi-city study with 8 different cities. So we will randomize 4 small communities on the West Coast and 4 small communities either on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast to either have these interventions with these new redesigns and also to have controls, so we'll be able to compare outcomes between these 2 cities. We'd like to investigate these cities over longer time periods to track their progress, and so we propose to offer financial incentives to for human participants to encourage their participation in these studies over time.
We know that relocation and recovery efforts are extremely expensive, and unfortunately we're often paying for things after the fact rather than spending the money up front to make the design more resilient. In the cases of cities, say on the East Coast, that are more susceptible to extreme weather events, the raised cities would include evacuation type procedures, but that recovery process should be less expensive upon return because of lower damage in a variety of areas, economic, health, etc. And we expect that the process of the communities working together to design those floating or raised cities would increase social cohesion. Instead of not knowing what the future holds, having a solution that they're confident in. To reiterate, the evidence for these events include a variety of traditional experiences around the world.
Thank you.
My name is Sietske Kimball, and I would like to thank my team members listed on the slide here for their contributions to this project outline. We talked about coastal community and risk, and multidisciplinary observing networks, and then very importantly, a new approach to conducting this kind of research and delivering results to the communities that it is intended for. So the idea in a nutshell is that we're going to address the extreme short and long-term risks that coastal communities face, and then we want to collect, archive, analyze, and integrate data from a wide variety of sources. This is very important, and these include things like atmospheric data, oceanographic data, sea level data from automated sensors, socioeconomic data, recreational use data, travel and tourism statistics, a wide range of different things, as you can see. So then it's important to somehow synthesize this data of many different characteristics across different disciplines so that we can understand coastal risks at coastal zones and then plan for resilience to these short and long-term effects that these communities face. So the specific differentiating recommendations that we came up with was to collect new and exciting environmental, social, economic, and cultural data from a greater array of sources, and these include, so these are the entities that will provide us the data. So that will be citizen science, citizens going into the field physically collecting data for us, including K through 12 educational opportunities with this. Resident attitudes and perceptions, communities themselves as a whole, local decision makers, scientists, engineers, government and non-governmental entities. And then we want to co-develop these data and the models that we're going to integrate them with the stakeholders along the way. The different models that we're looking at will be numerical, statistical, GIS, and whatever other models will be appropriate. Then, importantly, the data from these models needs to be communicated back to the environments or the communities that they're important for. So we're going to co-develop with those communities a way to effectively communicate those results. So the impact and value will be emergency and long-term planning and response information, coastal sea level adaptation and mitigation strategies, broadening participation in science, generate a comprehensive data archive, long-term data archive, promoting locally informed, community-involved, and science-based decision making, engaging the stakeholders, and K through 12 and informal learning through recreation and travel experience. So supporting evidence, we know a lot of long-term effects affect our communities. I would like to thank you for that.
All right, good morning. We are the B team, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about how we might take this idea of these multidisciplinary observatories to answer a very specific question. So we were thinking about the fate of coastal communities and whether their fate is sort of this dramatic destruction in a hurricane or other major event, or whether it's really a death by 1,000 cuts, be those economic, social, or physical. So we're a team of social scientist, an engineer, and a restoration practitioner. And our research in a nutshell was how temporal scales of change impact the response of coupled human and natural systems. And that's sort of what our diagram represents. We know that human and natural forcings drive both incremental change, and those incremental changes are punctuated by extreme events. But we don't know what's most important and how those time scales act synergistically or antagonistically to drive human and natural system response. So we want to analyze the feedbacks between these human and natural drivers, the natural ecosystem, the built environment, and the populations that inhabit them by utilizing these coastal community multidisciplinary observing and modeling networks, which very similar to the preceding group, we have a stakeholder advisory group that consists of a business community, local utilities, and local community members, and an interdisciplinary research team. We are integrating data layers and streams of real-time data, such as climate and weather, but also annual changes in transportation or geomorphology at the coast, integrating these into predictive modeling framework to come up with scenarios and predictions that are then communicated and refined by these stakeholder and interdisciplinary research teams as sort of an iterative approach to these questions. We believe this has the impact and value of quantifying risks in these couple systems, both over the long term and with these extreme events, as well as quantifying the interaction between those. And we hope that this will be a tool for enhancing community resilience, supporting sustainable economic development and investment, and promoting the co-development of research priorities and the implementation of solutions. Finally, I'll give you two examples of this. We have one picture here of Wallace, North Carolina after Hurricane Florence. I believe this was $50 billion in estimated damage. And then next door you have a picture of the community of Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana, which was moved by the federal government at the cost of about $250,000 a person after 70+ years of erosion and other changes. And that economic amount maybe not be a lot, but we really haven't accounted for all the small changes in society, economic, and human health that go along with those slow changes. Thank you for your time, and thank you to my team.
Good morning. My name is Kristen Wilson Grimes from the University of the Virgin Islands, and on behalf of this team, I am pleased to present the Islands Alliance. Island communities face distinct challenges and opportunities compared to their mainland counterparts because of their geographic isolation and unique cultural, historical, political, socioeconomic, geologic, hydrologic, and ecological settings. In addition, there is considerable disparity in the allocation of our national research investments, which further marginalize these communities. Here we've mapped the NSF's coastal long-term ecological research sites, national estuary programs, national estuarine research reserves, and national marine labs. And what this figure shows is there has been considerable investment along US mainland coastlands, while relatively less has been made in islands in the US Caribbean, the Alaskan Island Archipelago, and the US Pacific Island states, territories, and affiliated islands. These island communities are also majority underrepresented minorities and underserved groups in STEM. But together, as a unified Islands Alliance, these communities can achieve much more collectively than they can on their own, and provide a rare opportunity to understand how to more effectively engage and retain underrepresented and underserved groups in STEM. Therefore, we propose to build an Islands Alliance that asks two questions. How does creation of an Islands Alliance leverage existing knowledge, fill gaps in expertise, build local capacity, and empower communities to solve local, regional, national, and even international coastal problems? And two, how does participation in the Islands Alliance increase individual self-efficacy, interest, and engagement in STEM? An Islands Alliance will give coastal communities agency to engage, address, and solve collective coastal problems, and grow the national STEM workforce by increasing our understanding of context-specific, culturally relevant best practices for engaging underrepresented and underserved groups in STEM, thus transforming the face of science moving forward. Join us, Islands Alliance, uniting island communities to solve coastal problems. Thank you.
Good morning. We are proposing the development of a coastal knowledge exchange. We propose to create a coastal knowledge exchange to build connections and peer learning between communities and scientists. This includes employing an online forum, social networking approach to share, organize, concentrate, and grow the exchange of knowledge on coastal issues, science, and solutions. We will crowdsource solutions to the problems facing coastal areas throughout the world. The Coastal Knowledge Exchange is an easy-to-use, web-based, transdisciplinary forum for exchanging information on solutions to coastal issues. It is a social network that uses a crowdsourcing approach to grow, discuss, and easily identify answers to critical questions and enable discussions. In the Coastal Knowledge Exchange, community members and resource managers will be encouraged to submit questions on key issues. Scientists, students, and other managers will be able to add their thoughts or experiences, research or real world. The community of research users will use a system of up and down votes to peer review posted solutions. Traditionally, scientists have interacted with communities as end users or as generators of ideas. Another common model is to interact at the beginning of a project to identify needs and then disseminate results at the end. We are proposing a transdisciplinary approach, which entails scientists and community members working together in an integrative, iterative process to address complex, entangled problems. Ambassadors from diverse agencies, disciplines, and regions will solicit participation, organize trainings around popular topics, and facilitate face-to-face interactions engaging marginalized communities. The Coastal Knowledge Exchange seeks to facilitate connecting people, citizens, communities, and scientists to find solutions to the problems that are impacting coastal areas around the world. We also propose connecting scientist to scientists for interdisciplinary dialogue to address the problems of coastal areas. We hope to connect coastal communities with each other to learn what solutions have been tried, what has worked, and what has not. The Coastal Knowledge Exchange promotes multi-directional education, where communities can educate scientists of their needs and challenges, and scientists can advise communities on potential risk and active research that may contribute to local solutions. Popular and high-impact topics can be explored further through webinars or roundtables organized by the Coastal Knowledge Exchange ambassadors. Finally, there would be a community storytelling component allowing collective learning from shared experiences. Thank you.
Good day. My name is Jeff Trussell. I'm here representing Emma Cutler, Dana Hunt, Paul Kirshen, and Meredith Welsh-Devine. As we all know, over the last 3 days, I've come to appreciate how complex the challenges are facing coastal communities. And so when we endeavored to address this issue, we really wanted to get a sense of how is this complexity emerging as a result of both short and long-term drivers. And rather than come up with a specific problem, for example, living shorelines or coastal pollution, we wanted to develop a conceptual framework that would easily be applied to a variety of problems facing coastal communities. So the first objective was to really establish what the drivers are, and this is by no means exhaustive, but of course we have short-term events like flooding associated with hurricanes. We have long-term drivers such as sea level rise, population and land use changes in human values, and of course technological innovation. And all these factors, drivers, again not exhaustive, are interacting with other issues. We have multiple stakeholders, we have dynamic feedbacks, and of course we have stochasticity that can really impair our predictive power. And it's this limited predictive power that ultimately we think is creating real challenges in terms of developing innovative solutions to the threats facing coastal communities. So again, here is our conceptual framework, and really what this is intended to be is a roadmap for how to approach this complexity, how to resolve this complexity to increase predictive power. So on the left side of the diagram, we have the various parameters that are defining the complexity of the system. And then we have in our right box what we call the adaptation process, and you'll see that this is a research-driven gear involving scientists, engineers, and social scientists, and of course the stakeholders are nested within that because ultimately we think that stakeholder-informed research is going to be a priority going forward. Of course, through this iterative process, we generate data, conduct experiments, use models that can then produce a variety of solutions such as decision support tools, new policies, informed decision making. And of course, these have outcomes that are going to change dynamically through time. So this iteration will proceed continuously until we develop adaptive solutions that are robust, but again, recognizing that the time scale of that adaptation's robustness may be limited. The value, obviously addressing the complexities of these systems, both in terms of their individual parts, but also creating integrated synthesis is key. We think that this is the ideal roadmap for addressing these problems. The value, of course, is to the interdisciplinary research community as well as the stakeholders involved. And finally, we think that ultimately our inability to address complexity and the resulting lack of predictive power has really hampered our ability to respond to the threats facing coastal communities. Thank you.
Morning. Our idea is entitled Fundamental Research on Natural and Constructed Living Shorelines, their contributions to ecosystem vitality, coastal resilience, community integration, and local economies. The team is Vidya, Joel, Krish, myself, and Tatiana.
Our idea, in a nutshell, is to advance understanding of how living shorelines, both natural and constructed, can enhance understanding of ecosystem services and build coastal community resilience. In order to be able to do this, we need neighborhood-driven design processes that take into account how individuals and communities want their waterfronts to look like and what types of functions they expect their shorelines to perform. This would be followed by a demonstration project that's sited in a socio-economically vulnerable neighborhood designed to answer research questions about the long-term viability of living shoreline projects. A cost-benefit analysis that compares living shorelines to hardened structures in different sea level rise scenarios at the parcel level would help make the case for resilient and economic living shoreline project siting. There's also a need to quantify and translate ecosystem service benefits of constructed living shorelines, and to model their impacts on socio-political and the biophysical shoreline environment. In order to effectively broaden participation, there's a need to involve pre-K through 12 and community colleges in conceptually designing and implementing these projects to evaluate the potential of green infrastructure in contributing to jobs for our future workforce.
The modeling, prototyping, and evaluation of living shorelines is intended to equitably provide a range of ecosystem services to communities increasingly threatened by coastal hazards arising out of climate change. Living shorelines are about creating and sustaining communities, both biological and social, with the goal of developing recreational and economic opportunities while fostering a sense of place, belonging, and well-being in those communities. This type of research is necessarily transdisciplinary, requiring a collaboration between scientists, engineers, designers, policymakers, and social scientists. To gain and leverage support from policymakers and attain buy-in from landowners, we need scientific data that validates the efficacy of living shorelines across a heterogeneous coastline. Ultimately, to ensure that this work serves coastal communities equitably, we need to clearly understand and to engage participation from the communities throughout the process. Thank you.
It's been really fun working on this with the team, but we also want to thank NSF, UCAR, and KI for this opportunity.
Good morning. This project was created by two of three of us. The main idea is to realize that current coastal areas are very vulnerable, and the vulnerability lead to tremendous cost to the society and natural system. So we believe that the solution to that is to create a new form of urban systems that is adaptable and resilient to the challenges that coastal area face. So we propose to have a research hub that focus on plan, design, and develop new type of cities and retrofit existing ones, and develop innovative and cost-effective technologies and methodology, making our city more resilient.
I'm Zira Razak from Old Dominion University. Here are some recommendations. Evolve design codes for bridges and buildings and critical infrastructure to withstand coastal hazards. Develop retrofitting methods to strengthen built environment. Enhance social networks and broaden community engagements. And formulate equitable financing approaches. So if you look at the bottom left photo, you can have a house detached from its footing because of dynamic forces of waves, and we need to quantify those forces. So right now they are very loosely defined. Then on the bottom right, you see a picture of a typical house, and it can be hit by another house hitting it, or it could be hit by debris, which could be like large utility poles hitting it. We need to know what forces are being generated by those floating objects so we can properly design the footing for a house like that. And of course, some people say, well, why not have a floating house, such as the one shown in the middle? The only thing is, if you want to do that, and if you are married, and if you have argument with your spouse, you need to know how to swim to the shore, right? So that's the challenge that you'll face.
All right. In terms of impact, broadly speaking, we expect this initiative to result in prevention of degradation of public health, culture, ecology, property, and the general quality of life. And that can be realized through innovative engineering solutions and broadly acceptable policies and solutions through multi-stakeholder engagement, multidisciplinary teams. And in terms of evidence and justice, there's scientific evidence for rapid sea level rise, and more people are moving to these communities, and clearly the current way these cities are functioning is not working, so we need new solutions. Thank you.
Good morning. Our candidate recommendation is motivated by what communities in our country either witnessed or experienced firsthand during recent events like Harvey, Florence, Irma, and others. These communities were faced with a large number of impacts during the storm, some of which they were unprepared for, as water from different sources converged in their built communities. With that in mind, our idea in a nutshell is to promote the coupling of watershed and coastal processes in these built environments to better forecast storm-induced hazards. Specifically, we suggest taking the vast amount of work that's been done in watershed communities and to build an understanding and models to predict precipitation, overland flow, river flow and routing, along with the work that's been done in coastal communities to predict waves, tides, surge, and run-up, and develop frameworks and models for how they interact in this built environment where there are special considerations needed for things like drainage, impervious surfaces, runoff management, and other management actions that have been taken historically. Because what's inside this blue rectangle varies significantly in spatial and temporal scales, all of the processes within there, we focus on a domain size, a domain size of a watershed scale with output resolution needed at finer scale, in particular the local parcels. While the initial focus is on the converging hydrodynamic and hydrologic processes in these built environments, these models can also take into account feedbacks from morphological change, like the erosion of protective sand dunes during a storm that can exacerbate flooding inland, large-scale landscape change, and infrastructure damage that happens during these events. These models can take into account and look at the influence of inlets and hurricane barriers on adjacent communities. They can look at the contaminant and nutrient transport. So as these flows are converging in the built environment, how are they transporting contaminants into and out of these built environments? To look at the economic impacts and any social equity considerations that are predicted by flooding or damage through these models. And while new data collection is needed because models require data, there's also the leveraging of existing data collection that we can use for validation. For instance, extensive water level networks that are in place, infrastructure damage that's surveyed after storms, and satellite-based observations. The value of this is that by outputting the model information on parcel scales, we can integrate that parcel scale information up to the community level. And at the community level, then we can look at vulnerability and inequity amongst those communities within the watersheds. It provides immediate information for real-time response for evacuations or rescues. They provide information for the long term to plan and mitigate for the vulnerability in these built environments, and promote the best practices for drainage and retention designs, the design of coastal flood defenses that are designed to keep the ocean out but also need to let river flow and drainage out towards the ocean, and looking at green and gray infrastructure. You can also use these to assess human health and ecosystem impacts from the flow of contaminants in these environments. Thank you.
Just a note, headquarters has reminded us that tweeting is encouraged, and remember the policy, not actually super specific details if it's a research project, but generalities and process stuff.
Our hub idea, in a nutshell, is can coastal community emergency operations management be made more efficient, effective, and equitable via enhanced situational awareness and risk anticipation. Underlying this is the design of a system to predict, sense, communicate, and respond. Coastal communities that have been impacted by hazards face a variety of needs, like needing food or water or functional need support for the most vulnerable. And meeting the needs of these people require moving things and people. People move out of an area as they evacuate. People move into and within an area as emergency services provide supports. And logistics is the science behind these movements, the science behind getting the right support to the right people at the right place and time. If we want a good response, we need good logistics. And if we want good logistics, we need good information. As an example, how can I plan how to deliver a set of critical supplies from their staging areas to their points of need if I don't have a real-time understanding of the road closures? Our idea to address this is to design and test cyber-physical infrastructure that will integrate data from a variety of streams. Surge model outputs will be combined with sensor data and citizen-provided volunteer geographic information to produce a road closure model. This will be integrated in a web GIS portal that will also pull in needs and population vulnerabilities, and it will be integrated with the logistical decision support system that will provide actionable information in real time to both emergency services and citizens as first responders. The science behind this is how do we determine what kind of information is needed to support decision making, and then how do we get and integrate that data? On the social sciences side, how is participation in volunteered geographic information affected? What are the barriers? This research will save lives and minimize damages in coastal communities that have been affected by hazards through better response. Emergency services, coastal citizens, and policymakers will be engaged from the start to both define the problem and determine system requirements. A new scientific field of coastal emergency intelligence will emerge. This will transform our understanding of how coastal communities respond to disasters. It will also build next-generation sensing and modeling capabilities. Significant loss of life and property following recent events such as Hurricane Maria form the basis for this need. Literature tells us that better response is possible when community-scale information is provided in real time, yet our current sensing and modeling capabilities do not meet this need. This CoPe hub idea on coastal emergency intelligence will address these gaps. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Scott Hagan, and I have the pleasure of representing my fellow contributors Ming, Navid, Ron, and Maria. To begin, what I want to do is present a conceptualization, not the conceptualization of a flood transition zone, and to try to get you to think a little bit about the impact that this can have on our community of coasts and people. So if you look at the figure on the left, you'll see in the upper reaches a green or aqua green in the Amite River area, the upland area where we have hydrologic flooding, and near Lake Pontchartrain, a blue region where we have flooding that's primarily dominated by coastal processes. In between, there exists a transition. And it is that transition that we would like to study with our research campaign idea. So when you consider that flood transition zone, it can really be expanded to many other areas of science and engineering, the biogeochemical processes that exist within it, the physical processes that we're going to try to explore and develop better governing equations that we can then describe numerically, the social and economic impacts that are associated with these flood transition zones, and the fact that we live in a non-stationary climate, and these transition zones are continuing to change because of changes that we see in precipitation, in storm intensities, and in population growth along our coasts. There are a lot of values and impacts that are associated with this, and certainly advances in basic science are very important to what we will be able to do with this idea, and to improve the fundamental understanding of our coastal systems. It's really a system of systems type approach that would need to be taken to fully appreciate all of the complexities. Certainly there would be aids in decision making, whether we're considering flood risk or whether we're considering other impacts that occur within these transition zones. We have in our recent past many events that express the challenges of the flood transition zones where the hydrologic processes meet the coastal processes. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, NSF, UCAR, and Known Innovations for my new science friends. We want to capture carbon, keep the poles frozen, and arrest sea level rise. And we propose a research hub for coastal science, engineering, and engagement to do this. Coastal communities are under long and short-term risk from sea level rise. People, industries, and governments are more likely to act with a positive, tractable, and hopeful vision. To advance action, we need a quantifiable, strategic, and achievable goal. We propose capture carbon, keep the poles frozen, and arrest sea level rise. This would preserve global ecological stability, maintain US strategic advantage in the Arctic, and sustain coastal communities, economies, and our quality of life on the coasts. In a nutshell, we want to work with multiple disciplines and sectors to find economically feasible and scalable solutions for coastal carbon sequestration that will keep the poles frozen and arrest sea level rise. We propose a simultaneous and integrated program that has these research components. Predict how much carbon we need to remove from the atmosphere to keep the poles frozen. This helps us choose scalable solutions. We need to discover, understand, and quantify natural carbon sequestration processes that already happen in the oceans, estuaries, and lakes. We need to engage public, private, and nonprofit sectors in assessing feasibility and trade-offs of these solutions for coastal carbon capture. We need to engineer new technologies and enhance coastal ecosystems for the purpose of carbon sequestration. And finally, we need to catalyze action across industry, government, and communities through the co-development and engagement process. Oh, that's not right. You missed a slide. There is an extra slide. Oh, there it is. I want to say, NSF has the mission, the capability, and the expertise to help us face a fundamental threat to our populations, our people, and our coasts. and we need their help to science the shit out of this problem. NASA got us to the moon and back, and we need NSF to turn the tide against sea level rise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are an interdisciplinary group of biologists, civil engineers, anthropologists, and hydrologists. And the question that we are particularly interested is how do we investigate the changing temporal scale of disturbances across our coastal zone from both ecosystem and human dimensions. This brings us to our broadest question, namely, how do short-term, defined as weeks to within months, stressors, storms, floods, droughts, spills, and so forth, and long-term, years, change stressors, nutrient loading, climate change, sea level rise, etc., influence coastal ecosystem and socioeconomic responses. To this, we've established a conceptual framework for both short-term and long-term responses. The short-term is delineated here with the blue boxes, and the long-term is the green line. As you see, timescale graphed against ecosystem and socioeconomic condition, whereas we generally think that as time advances, the long-term degradation is going to continue, but responses are going to be punctuated by these short-term and acute events. And these short-term punctuated events will presumably accentuate responses along that scale. And so this is a framework by when specific project hypotheses can be developed and tested. We have a number of recommendations along this path, and they range from evaluating, modeling, and forecasting how these stressors accentuate the frequency and magnitude of events, determine ecosystem and hydrological responses according to a suite of metrics, and evaluating how human perceptions influence decision-making, and assessing community vulnerabilities and adaptive capacities. And ultimately, this revolves around involving stakeholder engagement, education, and promoting awareness. There are numerous broader impacts and value ranging from enhancing scientific understanding, enhancing early warning, and enhancing coastal management, education, and outreach. Finally, there is significant rationale behind this concept. Over 50% of human population lives within 50 miles of the coast, and climate change is expected to significantly impact sea level rise. However, acute and short-term events are becoming more frequent, and there are numerous studies that show that coastal ecosystems and communities are vulnerable to profound shifts in future structure and function. I leave you with a final panel. This is a graph of sea level rise over approximately a century. The example shown here, and there are numerous examples across the coast, is from Atlantic City, New Jersey, where an annual sea level rise is approximately 4 millimeters per year. And this can have profound impacts on coastal ecosystems in the future. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. We're an interdisciplinary team of social scientists, a coastal ecologist, and a chemist. Our is more of a development phase of what a hub structure observation network might look like. Its mission, its foci, and its research themes. We wanted to look at coastlines and coastal communities that vary greatly across space, which they all do, and using something like NEON that NSF already has, looking at the physical and ecological attributes and processes and how they vary, the social, economic, political, historical attributes, and the rural-urban continuum. We think that this results in great variability in vulnerabilities and challenges and needs and research questions. And so we wanted to look at an inclusive, grounded, community-based approach to designing the hubs or research networks that captures the variability with an emphasis on building science community trust and relationships early and often and in meaningful, integrated, long-term ways.
We envision a two-phase approach. And this is in part because taking a community-based approach assumes that we know our communities, and we find that often we don't adequately know our communities. So in order to address this and to be more effective, our plan is to have phase 1 be a community assessment. So this would be the first RFP, and application would require a science community partnership. And candidate groups must identify their place on the rural-urban continuum, and this is a way to help us delineate where applications will be funded across zones. So if they are awarded, they will be assessed using a group of applied social science practitioners who will do essentially rapid assessments in the communities. Some of them may look very much like the scoping sessions we've been doing here. And when those are awarded, they will be awarded, we hope, in part based on the ability of the applicants to demonstrate that they fill a specific niche in community type, and also that their results from their community would be more broadly applicable. So once those assessments are done, they would be reported in a form that's available to researchers and community groups that would be interested in applying for phase 2. And they would also be reported in a way that would be available to planners or other people that may directly want the outputs. Then phase 2 is proposals that would be directly for hubs, but the key component is that they have to directly address information identified in phase 1.
So the impact and values of a community-based approach all stem from this unique kind of inside-out viewpoint that we would host. So one of the outputs that would come from phase 1 of the system was to create a vulnerability index that would take into account more factors than just population density when trying to identify areas that have need. This would also provide an informed approach to hub location. Community leaders and scientists would work together, and we would broaden community participation. So overall, we believe that hubs function most effectively when they recognize the unique challenges, nuances, and priorities of their constituent populations. And by using these vulnerability indexes in phase 1 of our project, we would be able to capture the differences between urban populations and more rural populations and help to better build bridges to coastal futures. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rob Tunstad with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm a soil scientist with them, and I'm here to and have the privilege of presenting with both my other colleagues on this project, Christopher Esposito and Greg Taylor, and also some other coastal pedologists that aren't here right now. Why? What's the need? What would be our project? Basically, this is a map of our current carbon stocks across the United States. This current data set is extremely limited at best, and the model, the current data set's extremely limited at best. It's an insufficient model at large scale carbon pools, stocks, and inventories. There's an overwhelming need to generate accurate and reliable coastal carbon inventories for multiple cross agencies. And we need to be able to predict carbon capture and patterns of carbon flux throughout our coastal areas. So this is basically just a map of the United States, but our coastal communities are extremely underrepresented on their coastal blue carbon capture and sequestration. Idea in a nutshell. Blue carbon represents a vast reservoir of sequestered atmospheric CO2. Current spatial density of our carbon content measurements are insufficient to adequately scale these particular carbon cycles. A program exists within the Natural Resources Conservation Service to collect measurements of carbon content in coastal wetlands to improve on that existing data. We propose to partner with other principal investigators, other like coastal scientists, coastal geomorphologists. By collaborating with an expert in the marsh and marsh evolution and a coastal geomorphic setting, the data can be integrated into the context of a historical landscape evolution and carbon pool dynamics. So we really do know that there's a lot of people that are concentrating their research in these coastal areas, and we would love to partner with you. Need to capture our carbon. The current coastal carbon research projects would be performed through a collaborative effort of partnerships through the CREMS network, NRCS, the Coastal Wetland Monitoring Programs, National Wetland Monitoring and Assessment Work Groups, National Estuarine Research Reserves, National Estuary Programs, coastal colleges and universities, and other interested stakeholder organizations and agencies. We'd like to partner with you if you're doing research and you want to know what your carbon is. Got coastal blue carbon? Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. Our idea is about developing a modular autonomous distributed ocean sensor network. And my colleagues here are Radu and Wenbo. And so basically the idea is to develop or consider a modular multi-domain autonomous ocean sensor network based on fixed and mobile sensor platforms coupled with machine learning based analysis of data would be valuable in improving modeling and prediction of coastal phenomena and providing real-time decision-making capability. So what this entails is that the network that we could have, I mean, there could be several solutions here, but the network could be secure, self-sustained, and autonomous, spanning air, sea surface, and underwater domains. It needs to be adaptive, enabling routine and event-based sampling, and involving fixed and mobile sensor platforms. The network design is driven by associated engineering challenges and stakeholder requirements, and that's why it's modular, depending on what the needs are. And it's powered by renewable energy with microgrids and or inductive coupling, so that you have self-sustaining facility. And then the acquired data are processed and analyzed using machine learning in real time for efficient feedback and data compression and improved modeling.
The sensor network has a number of impacts and values. For example, the network could result through commercialization. And the second one, the effort could lead to improved protection of ecosystems, coastline, and coastal infrastructure, because the sensor network could monitor the coastal system for long periods of time, and it will result in improved modeling and prediction because it could provide more data and information with higher spatial, temporal, and spectral resolution. And it could also help develop early detection and warning systems or for coastal hazards. And the last one is the real-time decision making.
In terms of justification for our recommendation, we believe that an agile, modular, and adaptive network will be complementing the existing networks like the Ocean Observatory Initiative that NSF already sponsors. And the idea is that we can move it and structure it as needed. And using machine learning algorithm, we can optimize data processing and compression. And everything is made possible through the use of new technology in armament systems, computer and sensor technology that are currently available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. How are we today? I feel like we ended up getting the hot potato when we chose our project because we had to deal with this very contentious issue of coastal retreat. And so I'll show you a picture here with the introductory title of an area close to where I live, and you can see that most coastlines are the intersection of the human-built environment as well as the natural environment. Now, my 1-year-old, she will probably be around in 2100 when this scenario looks like this. Many of our coastlines are going to change in a single human lifetime to have much more inundated areas, both in the urban as well as the natural environment. And we as a society need to begin to address this problem. I'd like to thank my 3 other collaborators, Anna Maria, Maritza, and Susan. And we really thought a lot about this issue from many different perspectives. Today, we're already seeing the beginnings of this problem, and it looks like this. We call it nuisance flooding. That's great. As you can imagine, 100 years from now, many of these houses will be at least on the first floor routinely inundated. Therefore, people will probably not wish to live there. So how do we, as a society and as scientists, begin to address this problem? Research recommendations. We need to think about terminology carefully. So strategic retreat or retreat is a defeatist language. We need to come up with more positive terms, and focus groups that include various stakeholders need to be engaged in this process so that they can begin to come up with terminology that is ones that they wish to adopt. We need to study strategies to accommodate change in both the human and the natural environment. As you saw on that first slide, these things are going to happen simultaneously. In terms of protecting the natural environment, in many cases, we need to get the built environment out of the way. Accommodation space, green space, and other strategies need to be incorporated into scenarios that coastal communities can use to begin to plan how that coastline is going to change and be able to maintain the natural environment and its positive benefits. We also need to address and identify policy mechanisms, incentives, and other issues that are currently impeding some of these activities. The impact and value, we hope that overall this discussion will lead to a mitigation in the loss of coastal change, engage more vulnerable and disadvantaged populations in the process, communicate different scenarios to these coastal communities that are scaled at the appropriate level to the individual and to the community to empower them to make decisions. Provide the tools and the evidence they need to support that planning process. So why do we care? As a society, we need to begin the discussion and the process to prevent future loss, not just of infrastructure, but of economic well-being, of environmental well-being, and so on. And we have to begin to adjust to the reality of these coastal changes and decide how to move forward. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Miller from Stevens Institute of Technology. I'm a coastal engineer, and I have the pleasure of representing a wonderful multidisciplinary group that you see here standing with me. We're going to talk to you a little bit about coastal change and dynamic communities. So in a nutshell, coasts are dynamic, communities tend not to be, and how do we reconcile this? And how do we come up with some research that will help us become more dynamic? So the specific recommendation is to start by looking at feedbacks, feedbacks between various systems. These are the natural systems, the built systems. The example that we used is a beach nourishment project. Storm happens, beach is nourished, provides an opportunity for dunes to form, so there's an ecological feedback. The human response is to build bigger houses behind the beach nourishment project, and the idea of kind of tracking these feedbacks through time, looking at what we've done in the past and how we can do things better to create better futures. Once we do this, we're going to consider a range of plausible future scenarios. These future scenarios include future environmental scenarios, climate change, sea level rise, et cetera, but also scenarios in terms of, again, the way we apply the knowledge from these past feedbacks to potential future feedbacks so that we can change the trajectory of living along the coast. One of the most important things is to incorporate community input in this process. Without the community input, without the buy-in, there's going to be less support for strategically following any of the recommendations that come through. So the value delivery, The value is research that identifies factors that help communities move away from clutching on to the status quo, which is the standard of practice currently. Understanding that coasts are changing and making it possible for communities to think on longer time frames and longer horizons, something like 50 to 100 years. This would include understanding or identifying the feedback loops, tipping points. So at what point do we drastically have to change the way in which we live and interact with the coast? Examples are strategic retreat, but also potentially massive storm surge barriers and massive engineering infrastructure that will change the way that these systems interact with one another. Understanding the cost of not doing anything, and identifying what level of risk is tolerable. Ultimately, the idea is to create dynamic cities. So this is all needed because coastal development is likely to continue in redevelopment. There's a lack of awareness and acceptance. Coasts are dynamic places. Currently, we favor the status quo. In order to be able to prepare for a changing environment, we need to become more dynamic and conduct research which enables communities to proactively respond, not reactively respond to coastal changes. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. So our group, I'm Anthony, and our group was looking at, with Monica and Jared, we were looking at ways to incorporate equity into coastal research and planning. And our goal in looking at that was to think about not just about broadening participation, but also making research into equity a forefront of these kinds of efforts rather than something that kind of comes in at the end of the day into the work. So in the context of climate, our idea in a nutshell is how will the climate change effects, so those drivers may be different depending on the community, exacerbate and change existing inequalities in coastal areas, and figuring out what the mechanisms are that will lead to those exacerbations or at least maintaining inequalities and inequities in systems along the coast. The recommendations we had for the project kind of are, again, trying to blend being actual research, but also, while doing the research, broadening what the community is and participation in research. And we're thinking that the way this could be set up is looking at a diverse range of research sites that are facing different kinds of equity issues depending on the location. We'd include urban and rural sites and those sites that have different policy and planning contexts, similar in some ways to some of the hub discussions that were going on earlier. Looking at the key axes of social and economic difference across sites. So those would be things like racial and ethnic difference, age difference, citizenship status, economic differences, obviously. Delineating how those social inequities impact the coastal change and adaptation processes in response to sea level rise and fish stock migrations, for example. So are certain communities being more effective in what ways from relocation, which was mentioned earlier. And hopefully through the process, figure out what are the roadblocks to having two-way communication. So communication not just from the scientists and decision makers to the communities, but also from the communities and the underserved portions of those communities back up to decision makers and scientists. And as part of that, we really think it's important to include the community members and folks from those groups as funded partners in the research and not only as end user research. So it's not just that they're under a microscope, but they're also engaged in part of the research process. We're hoping that this will lead to more inclusive planning for community changes, removing those barriers for communication. You have better policies for understanding community motivations and needs, and hopefully transform the dynamics of climate adaptation research so that equity is considered upfront rather than, again, at the end of the day. And again, there's a lot of supporting information for this that some of you may already be familiar with. A lot of emerging research is documented in climate planning processes. Underrepresented communities are underrepresented in those efforts. And most coastal research does not include equity considerations. And we know the metrics that are out there are limited and they don't go beyond giving us a snapshot of what's going on from like census data. So thanks very much. Been a great experience.
Hello, my name is Jessica Frank, and I'm presenting on behalf of my group today our candidate hub recommendation for how coastlines and people can be organized, and we're calling this hub recommendation Coastal Intelligence. The idea in a nutshell is that CoPe should exist as a virtual social network that can rapidly share information over large geographic scale. We've heard a lot of great ideas today, and the idea is a virtual social network can host researchers, stakeholders, and these research outcomes, research proposals in a dynamic way to create coastal intelligence globally. So specifically, we're interested in an intelligent virtual social network that links researchers and stakeholders in an interactive space to build partnerships and drive innovation. We would like this social network to host a dynamic repository of research and program outcomes to inform current and future research and drive innovation in the development of new technologies. The idea is that it integrates and synthesizes information and data from existing environmental, social, economic, public health knowledge domains, and it could be broader than this. We know that there are broader disciplines than what's listed there. The impact or value that it seeks to deliver is that it can facilitate rapid sharing of existing knowledge, resources, and talent. It can promote and drive partnership building that can be leveraged for research and program initiatives. Especially, we've heard about citizen science projects, as well as the creation of a user base that can be tapped as research participants. The repository of information can be mined to inform time-sensitive policy decisions, and it can be used to crowdsource solutions driven by multidisciplinary connections that can have broad cross-sector and cross-functional applications. Another aspect that's not listed here is that we know social networks have robust user information that can be used to identify convergent issues in coastal areas as well as divergent issues in coastal areas, and we can use this database to understand what has worked, what hasn't worked, what were the challenges to inform future research and programs. Virtual social networks have been demonstrated to be effective at building engagement and partnerships and driving innovation. An intelligent virtual social network for coastlines and people would broaden participation globally, which would allow for the increase of data coverage temporally, spatially, and culturally. It will also facilitate the identification of gaps and suggest new research and innovation. And it's also economic. It reduces redundancy and facilitates the, I don't even remember what it said. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank my co-conspirators, Billy and Lori, before I begin. Coastal ecosystems, especially marshes, are known to provide all sorts of services to people and to communities, including things like removing pollutants from surface and groundwaters, as well as providing habitat for economically important species. But it's devilishly difficult to get across the idea of the value of these ecosystems to communities and actually have them engage in rational management decisions, incorporating that knowledge. And partly that's a cultural thing, so that's a terrible issue. So on the other side, there's a lot of need for continued research to understand more how these services vary in time and over space. And so we are proposing a mechanism to sort of solve both problems at the same time, and sort of synergistically building scientific and social capital so that we can communicate this information more effectively. And citizen science is very useful because partly it's very good way to build social capital and also build scientific outcomes. And I'm just going to use an example that I've been involved with. I've been working with a teacher who is serving a very underrepresented largely immigrant community that's economically disadvantaged. And we've been training her students to engage in measurements, sort of advanced measurements of vegetation as well as nitrogen concentrations in sediments. And this collaboration has allowed me to address all sorts of interesting scientific questions, and it's been of immense value to them because they get this experience that results in fellowships, and there's actually direct monetary benefit to them and their families. So we both have a stake in the matter, but that stake doesn't lead to communication with the community. So what we're proposing is that we use this relationship and these students to actually help engage the community by having the students involved in distributing information about science and to the community through meetings with associations, meetings with legislators, meetings on social media. And the idea then is that we can try to build a little bit of trust with the community by working through the students. And this represents an opportunity for the students in terms of getting civic exposure and experience, but it also represents an opportunity then to do social science, to understand what works and what doesn't in terms of transmitting that information, and that can inform our practice going forward. And finally, we want to take this model and try to expand it by essentially having the schools across Long Island start to develop this Adopt a Marsh program where they essentially run the same thing across Long Island. And the idea is to develop kind of a low-grade monitoring network that's large, that's wide scale. It allows us to ask different kinds of questions. And then also to use this as a model to look at different kinds of citizen science communities. It might not be students, it might not be based in schools, it could be based in different kinds of institutions. Yes, and thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Hanadi Rifai, and I'm from the University of Houston, and along with my colleague Vijay Gupta, we want to talk to you about our idea for a virtual hub, CoPe. This is a virtual network for facilitating collaborations and broadening participation in CoPe. Our idea in a nutshell is to develop a virtual hub. This would facilitate inclusion and integration, and would help us form a cohesive community of all of us. It's going to be a cost-effective, scalable, dynamic, and self-sustaining manner. Our specific differentiated recommendations is that VHub CoPe would be a web portal. It would have multiple components. One is we want a map of research and knowledge landscape. Who's doing what, where, and when. Two, we want to have a forum. We want to promote discussion, disseminate results, and form teams. Three, we would like to have a platform to share best practices and content that's specifically developed for education and outreach. Four, we want to form listservs, smaller communities that would interact on a shared interest and also have the opportunity to have physical meetings if they choose to do so. We'd like to create an innovation space in our VHub where industry, the private sector, organizations, local governments can pitch challenges that they have to teams, and these teams are dynamic. They're formed from the hub or outside the hub, and they can include anyone from anywhere without really having to be co-located, but they can share working on these solutions. Six, we'd like to have a clearinghouse for research opportunities for undergraduates, for students, for high schoolers, for K through 12, or anyone really who would like to have a research opportunity, whether in an REU format or some other kind of research with faculty. Now, the impact and value cannot be understated of this virtual hub. It will connect all of us. It will serve the vitally important function of forming and mapping communities of researchers, educators, practitioners, and stakeholders. It'll engage different constituencies and serve as a dynamic knowledge base that's continually being updated and being novel. It'll avoid duplication of effort, because if you know what others are doing out there, then you build on that and you don't replicate it. It'll also enable formation of interdisciplinary teams that are dynamic and form because they're interested in working with each other. So I will close with some reasoning and supporting evidence and start out by saying that this initiative would be informed by past successes, things like teachengineering.org that have proven time and again that you can do this. Teachengineering.org, anyone can submit lesson plans and activities. They're curated by volunteers who know the topic really well, and then the lesson plans are posted with their activities for anyone to use. We want to surmount conventional methods that cannot facilitate community formation, and our biggest pitch is that this would transcend geography, it would transcend time, would really build a network and a community in CoPe. Thank you very much.
Hello, how are you? My name is Mike Madden. I'm an atmospheric scientist at NC State University. I'm also an artist, and I'm here today to talk to you especially about an issue that I really care about and I'm passionate about, and I want to talk specifically about the roles of the artistic community, especially with regard to coastal issues, and here's why. The arts are an incredibly powerful and influential force in society. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Star Trek, got so many people to care about the sciences. Even further, John James Audubon, Monet, Guy Harvey got people to focus on conservation efforts. Even more, we have Christina Mittermeier, the famous photographer for National Geographic, shocked the world with this photograph, got people to become more aware of climate issues. And one of my personal heroes, Philip Glass, his contributions to the movie Koyaanisqatsi got me to think a lot more about the effects of urbanization upon society. So, saying that, knowing the impacts of the arts, I challenge you all to make strong, long-lasting connections with the artistic community in the coastal regions, to broaden participation, to educate the public, to generate awareness of these coastal issues. And keep in mind, there's a wealth of artistic communities out there. Art, painters, sculptors, comedians, authors, musicians. The sky is the limit, folks. And further, think about all the potential opportunities at your disposal. Working with local, state, and national museums. Merging arts and sciences together with creative projects in K-12 institutions. Furthermore, artists could help us identify the relevant materials for educators and instructors, children's books about coastline issues, asking stage performers to help us craft better presentations. Sometimes science communication workshops aren't enough. Sometimes you need to figure out how to command the stage and how to project to the back row. Seriously, those things matter. Those things matter. Do not count the artist community out. And we could solicit input from graphic designers, video and audio specialists for better outreach, Instagram, YouTube. So I challenge you all to think of really interesting projects, because when I've talked to you all during this conference, I've heard many different ideas, all of them fantastic. Now, personal story. Before I got into the sciences, I was an artist. I was in theater. I was at the Missouri Fine Arts Academy, that's me at a conducting class, and I was inspired to get into the sciences through the works of Georgia O'Keeffe, through Walter de Maria, who who sculpted this project called the Lightning Field, as you see here. That got me inspired to study meteorology and climatology. I challenge you all to think about this a little bit more. By pursuing these kinds of collaborations, you end up reaching people that you may not otherwise reach. And you may, I challenge you all sincerely to think about this. I strongly believe in the power of the arts to motivate, to inform, and to inspire. And I encourage you all to collaborate with a very important community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for closing on very passionate presentation. Actually, I sense that among all of you, and I really thank you for that, for bringing your passion to the stage. We really look forward to reading all of your white papers, all the energy you put in today and you'll be putting in the future. I'm glad to hear you've made new science friends. So go forth. But for now, we're going to close the live feed from Atlanta. Chicago will begin in about half an hour, I believe. You are free to, well, I don't think we can do lunch, but we got Tim with some announcements, and then he'll tell you what to do next. So again, thank you all very much.